The problem is that if a reference type is null, it doesn't have the properties and methods of a non-null instance of the type. For example, a non-null string has a length property that returns the number of characters in the string. If you attempt to access this property in a null string, it causes an exception. So what I'm going to do here is uncomment this line of code. So I'm declaring my string, initializing it to null, and then I'm going to display my string is my string. That'll be empty because it's a null value. Null value doesn't display as a string. And it has a length of myString.length. So here is where the problem occurs. My string is null. Nulls don't have a length property, and so this is going to cause an exception. If it had a string, for example, my string contained LearnNowOnline as the string, those characters, then it would have a length of whatever the length is, 10 or 12 or 15 characters, whatever that is. All right, so I'll go ahead and run this code with that statement uncommented. And I'll press O for the null coalescing operator options. And there's that exception. It's a null reference exception. This is the bane of C# programmers. Never a good thing to get. Unhandled exception of type system.nullReferenceException occurred in this program. And it says object reference not set to an instance of an object. So that's common language runtime speak for I'm trying to access a property or a method of a null object. Null objects don't have properties and methods, and so I can't do this. It's a problem. Okay, so I'll stop executing that, and I'll comment that line back out. I hit Control-Z a little bit too much. Okay, there we are. Now, there's various ways to remedy this problem, including perhaps asking the user for a valid value, setting an object reference to a valid object. Or in this case, you could just automatically assign an empty string to myString so that later code that expects a non-null string executes without problem. To implement this kind of a fix, you could use an if statement like this code right here. So the conditional expression within the parentheses tests to see if myString is null. And then, if it is null, it assigns the string the empty string to empty brackets. Or I could use string.empty. Same effect. Now, an empty string has no content, but it's something. It's not null. So this prevents a runtime error on the write line statement. Keep in mind that the error occurs because although a non-null string has a length property, which returns the length of the string, a null does not. So if my string were null, when that line executes, then you get a runtime error, as I showed you just a moment ago. Okay, so in this case what's going to happen is that if my string is null, which it is when it gets here, but typically you would have some other code in here that changes the value of my string and initializes something else or whatever. But if you get through all that code and it's still null, it's going to be set to the empty string. And now this statement, this line of code, is going to execute successfully. And it's going to say my string is empty string in essence. And it has a length of myString.length, which will say 0. So I'll go ahead and run this again just to see the results of that code so far. I'll press O again, and there's that first result. My string is, so that's the null value, or the empty string appearing there, and it has a length of 0. So this time, this myString.length, that property was able to access the string and return 0 because it's an empty string. So all is well in the world. But here's the thing. This kind of solution is used so frequently that an early version of C#, Microsoft introduced the null coalescing operator, which are 2 question marks. And they introduced it in order to simplify the code that you need to write in this situation. Instead of writing this if statement to assign the string a non-null value, you could write a single statement instead. So here I'm restoring my string to null, and then I'm using the null coalescing operator right there, 2 question marks, in order to change the value of my string. So what this statement is doing is it's saying, if my string is null, then set my string to this value instead. But if my string is not null, so it has some sort of string already in it, including the empty string, then it's going to assign the value of that string to my string, essentially to itself. Now, it's not necessary to do this with the same variable. I could test to see if my string is null or not, and assign either the value of my string, if it's not null, or the empty string in this case, to another variable as well. So there's nothing magical about operating this on the same variable. And so once again, it'll say, my string is my string. In this case, it's going to be an empty string there again, and it has a length of my string length. And this is the null coalescing version of the code. And also, you're not limited, as I mentioned, to using a single variable on both sides of the assignment operator. You can use any source data you want. So this is code that demonstrates that. So I'm initializing your string to null. And then I'm saying your string, no coalescing operator, I'm not null. But this time I'm assigning it to a different variable. I'm using one variable to test for the null condition, and then I'm assigning something to my string. So if your string is null, which it will be in this case, then it's going to display I'm not null. So I'll run the program again and press O, and here are the second two cases. My string is null and it has a length of 0. So these two do the exact same thing. This uses an if clause, and this uses the null coalescing operator. And then here's the last one. My string is I'm not null, and it has a length of 13. And this is the updated version of the null coalescing operator. So both use the null coalescing operator, but are doing different things with the code. And you can go beyond this. You can create more complex statements by using arbitrarily complicated expressions on either side of the null coalescing operator, not just a single variable or literal value. The operator works by evaluating the operand to the left of the two question marks. If it's not null, the variable is set to the value of the expression, of that expression. If it is null, and only then does the operand to the right of the null coalescing operator get evaluated. And then that value becomes the value of the variable. You're not limited to using an expression with the null coalescing operator in assignment expressions. It'll work anywhere. So this type of a null coalescing expression could be either null or the type of the right side operand. So whenever you use the expression, it has to be able to accept either the null or the type. And in this particular case, because I'm using this with strings on both sides, that's not a problem, because this string could be null, this is a string, strings can be null, and I'm good. But if you're assigning this to a different kind of variable, then you need to be careful, particularly if you're doing some sort of conversions. Now, the null coalescing operator is really another example of a C# feature that doesn't really do anything new that was previously impossible. We always could write code like this. But it does help you write simpler, cleaner code that's easier to read and maintain, and saves keystrokes, which add up during a long day of coding. Okay, so that's one operator, one feature in C# that you can use to deal with nulls. But there's another pretty cool one that's a newer addition to C#. So one problem with nulls is that you often need to reference members of an object. And we kind of saw that in the previous example, where I needed to access the length property of the string. But here's a little bit different in an example. So let me get rid of the comment there. So in this case, I want to use the person object. Notice that I'm declaring and instantiating this object. And this is a custom object that I have within my project. So I come over here, person. You can see that I'm defining this class. It has some properties to it. So this is just a way to define a custom class. So the important thing here is that it's an object that I'm defining within my application, has various properties that I can access. I'm not going to talk more about objects and classes at this point in the course. Okay, so I have this person object, and I have this nameLen1 variable that I'm trying to declare, and it's of type integer. And I'm going to use that person object and access the first name property. That's a string, so it's going to return some sort of a string. And I want to get its length. Okay, but this isn't going to work. If I come over here to person, you can see the first name property. I'm not setting this to any kind of default value. And if you're already familiar with classes, I don't have a constructor that sets the value either. So when this is initialized, when this class comes into memory, first name is going to have a null value. So this is going to be null. But I don't even get that far because person itself is null. So it's going to read this null, try to access the first name property of a null. Nulls don't have properties, and so it's going to fail. And I'll go ahead and start the application. And I'll hit P for null conditional, and you see that we get the null reference exception. It's unhandled, and it said object reference is not set to an instance of the object. Saw that person is null. Null has no first name property, and so that's why we got the exception. Okay, so that's not going to work. By the way, this int with a question mark is what's called a nullable data type. It can hold either an integer or the null value. And you'll learn more about nullable types a little bit later in the course. Now, to protect against this kind of situation, you have to code defensively and write something like this code here. So I'm going to comment this out again and then uncomment this code. So this is what you used to have to do. You still could do it today. But this is defensive coding. It makes sure that person isn't null before attempting to use it. This time, this code is going to succeed because it's declaring the name len variable, testing to see if person is not equal to null. If it's not, then it's going to access that value. So it's going to read the first name property of person and get the length of that string. Otherwise, if person is null, then it's going to just assign null to name len1. But this is pretty messy code. It's hard to write, it's hard to read, adds a ton of code for such a common thing you have to do. And just gets messier if you have to check for more nulls down the line, such as if first name is null or even if person is not. So this just gets complicated. In fact, as I've written this code here, this code is going to fail because if person is not equal to null, then it's going to, that doesn't guarantee that first name is not null. So I in fact have to make this more complex because I have to check for the nullness of first name as well. Okay, so that's where the null conditional operator comes into play. So the form of this operator is question mark dot. So it's essentially a question mark in front of the dot operator. So the result is the same thing as this code here. So it's going to look at person. If person is null, it's going to return a null to namelen. If it's not null, it's going to access the first name property. Now, there is one difference between this code and this code. In this code, I'm evaluating the value of person, whatever this expression is. It doesn't have to be a single object. It can be different objects that return an object that's null or not null. There's a lot of things that can be going on here. It's going to be just any kind of expression. So it evaluates person once there, and then it evaluates person here again, assuming that it's not null. In this case, this statement is only going to evaluate person once. So when it's just an object variable like this, that's not a big boost to performance, but it can be depending on what kind of object you're actually accessing there. But the other thing it does is it makes your code much simpler and cleaner. You know, it's just a single line of code to replace all of this stuff right here. And it's also doing what amounts to a short circuiting. If this is null, it's not going to evaluate any of this other stuff over here, which again, depending on the object, depending on the depth of the objects and properties that you're accessing, could be a significant performance boost to your code. Okay, so we have this nice operator, works great. But there's still a problem with the code, and I've mentioned it. Even if person is not null, and therefore has a first name property, that property value could be null. It's a string. Strings are nullable. In that case, you're then trying to get the value of the length property of a null, which it doesn't have. So this code is once again going to fail with a null exception because person is null. I haven't done anything to change the value of person yet. Okay, so this code is going to again fail with a null reference exception. To handle that situation, what's really nice is that you can chain together the null conditional operators. So here, what's happening, again, this is the statement that is still going to fail because when I new up a person, first name is null. I'm not doing anything to assign a value to the first name property. So what I can do is I can use a null coalescing operator right there and then chain it right there. And now what's going to happen is that when this statement is executed, it's going to check to see if person is null. In this case, person is not null, so we're good there. It's then going to access the first name property and check if that is null. In this case, it is null. And so nameLang is going to get assigned the value of null. All right, and so then the code checks for null and then prints out something. And then here's an example of where first name is not null. So now I'm assigning the value of first name to Beatrice. And now person is not going to be null, so it's going to evaluate first name, which is also not null. And finally, at long last, we're going to be able to get to the length property of that first name value. And this would work the same way if this was an empty string, because an empty string is not null. Okay, so in this case, it's going to display, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's going to say that the length of the first name is 8 characters. Now, there's actually 2 forms of the null conditional operator. And this is for indexers. Oops, I'm jumping ahead. So, nice thing here is that the null conditional operator also works well with the null coalescing operator. So let's say that instead of assigning to nameLen2, I don't want to assign it null. I want to use just an int. An int value cannot accept null. It's a value type, cannot be null. And so in that case, what I can do is I can use that expression, the 2 null coalescing operators, person, null coalescing, checking to see if person is null. In this case, it's not null. First name, in this case, it is going to be null. So this expression here returns a null. Because again, I'm newing up a person, not assigning anything to first name, it's null. So now the null coalescing operator kicks in. I don't want to assign a null. I can't assign a null to. If I tried to, then I would get a null reference exception. So I'm going to assign it the value of 0. Okay, so for the business requirements of our application, whether the first name is null or an empty string, I'm just going to call that 0. So that's something we decide for the purpose of this application. That would not work for every application type, but it does here. Okay, and then it displays the length of first name, whatever that might be. And then same thing, now it's doing George. It's going to person is not null, first name is not null, gets the length. And so the value of this overall expression, including the null coalescing operator here, is that value right there, which in the case of George is going to be 6. So it's going to display 6 different characters. Okay, now to where I was prematurely jumping ahead. The other form of the null conditional operator is for indexers, and this is of this form that looks like this. So it's question mark and square bracket. So what's happening here is I'm doing a list of people. It's a collection of person objects. So I could have 0, or I could have a huge number of person objects in this list. So I'm first going to check to see if people is null, and specifically if the first indexer, the first instance of people in this collection is null. And in this case it's going to be because the list doesn't have any objects. And so it's doing the exact same thing, but this is essentially a collection of objects. I want the 0th one, which is the first item in the collection. If that doesn't exist, then I'm going to return a null value here. And then if I add a person to it, I can new up a list and call it people. So this is now a list with a person in it. This is a different kind of a problem. I have this code commented out because in this case, the list of people is not null, but there's also no 0th element. There still isn't. So here, people is null. Here, people of 0 is null. And so it does the same basic thing, except that if I try to do this, then it's going to give me an out of range exception because there is no 0th element. So you can start to see where things can still be kind of complicated depending on what the composition of this collection of people is going to be. But here I can add a person to people. Now it has one person, and then this is going to work just fine. Okay, I'll go ahead and run the code again by pressing F5. And I'll press P. And there you can see the length of first name is null because I used the null conditional in order to test that value. Null. Then I had Beatrice. Then I had the empty string. Actually, using the null coalescing operator, it was null, but I just used the value of 0. So that's why that value is 0 there. And then have a value of 6 when I assign the first name of George. Okay, and then a few other examples going down through that code.